Honestly, some Patreon topics and questions are quite straightforward, but sometimes they're so broad they're actually quite complicated, because British submarines versus Axis warships sounds fairly simple, but there are lots of examples. There are vessels which are successful and then later on not successful, as is the way with submarines. You can only throw so many sixes, it seems. But how to tackle this? How to tackle this seemingly open question? I decided to do it in a couple of ways in the same time, so hopefully you're going to enjoy it. I'm going to be looking at some of the wider concepts, some of the more generic factors and general factors, and some individual examples, both individual in terms of vessels and individual in terms of events. And I hope, therefore, to give a little bit of an overview and commute some of the understanding that I have been lucky enough to gain through many years of research and discussion with those who, in some cases, were involved and are sadly no longer with us, but in other cases were taught by those who were involved, and who have tried to pass on the lessons they learnt in that experience to future generations. One of the interesting things you find the longer you spend around armed forces is that the value of cultural memory, of institutional memory, is exceedingly important and exceedingly misunderstood. All too often, it is focused on the preservation of traditions. That is the thing which everyone, especially outside, focuses on, when actually it's the memories and reasons for those traditions which are the important things, which are the things which matter. It's the examples they provide, it's the standards they set. Why do you do something? Why do you not give in? Why do you not surrender? Why do you do the thing which everyone says is absolutely insane, but is the only way to actually achieve anything in this particular scenario? Often, it's because of your friends, but also it's because of the mental image, of the image engendered by that cultural, institutional memory scenario that you are having to live up to. In World War II, I often talk about the Tribal Class destroyers. And I know I'm talking about destroyers in a submarine video, but bear with me. They are a good example of a force which were told they were the elite of the elite as far as they were concerned, because they were already destroyermen, which in their view made them an elite. Serving on destroyers in the Royal Navy as their view was elite, because they were smaller crews. Those crews had to be good. They couldn't afford to have bad apples. They couldn't afford to carry any dead weight. They couldn't afford to carry anyone who couldn't do their job. So therefore, destroyermen had to be an elite. Not like those people in cruisers and capital ships, or even aircraft carriers, those swanning around on their great cruise liners, everyone able to specialise, no one having to muck in with your mates in different sections because they're short-handed. No, destroyermen, they had to be real sailors. They had to know everything. We're going to ignore the fact that sloops and a lot of other small ships, including submarines, of course, which are considered boats, existed and also required the same thing. That didn't occur to the destroyers. No. It was the destroyermen who were the elite. Then you had the Tribal Class, who were told that they had to be the tip of the spear. They had to be the ones who guided their fellow destroyers in and forged a path for them through enemy destroyers and enemy forces to allow those destroyers to hammer their torpedoes home. by night or by day, by fire or by fury, they had to get the job done. They were told this. They took this on. They listened to this. And they inscribed it on their souls. And they followed through. They followed through a lot. If you want another example from World War II, the SAS. Why did they do what they do? Well, they actually literally start out as a myth. A myth which is being used as propaganda to try and scare the Germans and scare the Italians and the other forces of the Axis in North Africa. And they turn around and go, well, this is cool, let's make this a reality. But now the reality has to live up to the myth, otherwise it falls apart. Starts out as a myth, then has to live up to it. That's the SAS. That is history. You have a similar thing with the Royal Navy Submarine Service. What do they consider themselves the best at? Intelligence, information, ambush. That's what they are critical for. That's what they think about themselves for. That's what they've been training to hone themselves for the last 20 years since World War One. Remember, this is a service which fought its way through World War One. They did good things then, they did daring things then. So, here we are. World War II. Now, when we're talking about the Royal Naval Service, it is important to remember it has a history which goes back a long time. We're talking this year over 120 years. It's 1900 when the Royal Navy orders their first 5 submarines. Electric boat company vessel designs built by Vickers at Barrow-in-Furness, which is still where submarines are built for the Royal Navy. In fact, the force might now still be just 6 SSNs and 4 SSBNs. That's 6 nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines and 4 ballistic missile submarines. 10 boats all in all. A fraction of the force it operated even 20 years ago. But they're still built in the same place, and they still have a reputation for excellence. The course which their commanders go through, the Perisher, is considered one of the finest and one of the toughest training courses for submarine commanders in the world, and passing it is still considered one of the gold standards. At the beginning of World War I, the force had consisted of less than 180 officers, a little over 1,200 ratings, and roughly 60 submarines. There's a debate as to how far over 60 it actually is, because it depends whether you consider all the boats in commission, all the boats in testing, and about to come into commission, all the boats under construction as well. There's a debate. I would say roughly 60 will make you happy. This is a force which during World War I will receive 5 of the 14 Victoria Crosses the Royal Navy wins. That's over a third of the VCs of World War I are won by the submarine service. That tells you something else. They're brave. Almost suicidally so, because let's be honest, it's rare. Victoria Crosses going to living people is quite rare. if you do survive and get the VC, it's usually a case of, oh my lord, how did that happen? It's not a case of, oh, you survived. Huh. It's more a case of, we're quite sure you survived. Reading this, we're quite sure you did. You're sure you're you? Yeah. You sure you're not a ghost? Reanimated corpse? No? Okay, you're real. Okay. You sure? Victoria Crosses aren't won easily. But by World War II, the Royal Navy is starting the war again with roughly 60 submarines. They had 9 under construction at that point, and by August 1945 they would have, let's see, a further 178 had been commissioned, but 76 have been lost. So by 1945 they have, and I still cannot believe this, because it seems so small, really. It really does. "171 submarines. But with that, they had done a lot. And one of the things you always have to remember in this scenario, because the reason it seems so small is you hear some of the numbers are built, especially by the Germans. What were the submarines for the Royal Navy doing? Because you see, the Germans is a quite easy case for the submarines. We can't get enough surface ships out easily enough into the Atlantic Ocean to prosecute a trade war, so we need to go submarines. But let's be honest, what are the British submarines doing? Okay, we know they're being nasty in the Mediterranean and generally causing upset and mayhem there. We also know they caused some trouble during Norway, during Operation Warships. I'll be talking about that a bit in this. And we know they get to the Pacific and are causing fun out there. I've seen their bases in Australia and various other places. They definitely had interesting times in the Pacific. But let's be honest. We hear about the German U-boat campaign. We hear about the American campaign against the Japanese, both. But the Royal Navy lives up to its, well, the Royal Navy Submarine Service lives up to its motto of being the silent service. I know, I've got to fix my chair, haven't I? It really does like to keep quiet. So, today's video hopefully will do a little bit to readdress that, but honestly, one of the problems with it is they really do keep quiet. I mean, there's the whole SAS, which are the secret air, the special air service, etc., and that was supposed to be so secretive, but seem to wait until they're out and then publish a book which tells you everything. And the Submariners don't do that. So, they're both equally secret whilst in service, but the Submariners are far less likely to publish a book than the SAS. I mean, I can understand why. The SAS book is far more easy to market than we snuck up to the point at which we were actually inside the enemy base perimeter, sat there and listened and recorded all the ship movements for hours, so we would know have exact profiles of all their engines and propeller shafts, so that if they come out we could spot them from miles away, as is probably quite a lot of the Cold War duties were something along the lines of. And before anyone says that, I am putting that together in my own head, but just reading between lines. But that's, in so many ways, just as brave and a lot more scary. A lot more scary. Anyway, Already mentioned chair, but Shameless book plug. Now, yes, chair squeaks. It needs to be oiled again. I have oiled it since we've got down here, but that doesn't seem to work that well. But I do like this chair. It was a present when I was a lot younger from my mother. And it's still comfy, but it does squeak. And I'm not sure if it's the joints which are squeaking or if somewhere else in it's squeaking. Anyway, leaving that to one side, it was this chair which bore my weight the whole way through writing this book. It was this chair which put up with the hours of editing. And I mean the hours of editing. It was this chair which put up with the days of research, sitting on top of it, reading. It's a good chair. It's also been the chair that I've used for my current books, which are just about to be hopefully coming out soon, if I can get everything together for Christmas. At this rate, recovery and moving house have proved interesting, but that's going to be something I'll discuss at the end of the video. So yeah, this chair was just as much a part of the process in some ways as the fluffy research assistants, in terms of its character being part of the background of putting this book together. And I like this book. It's the only one I have at the moment, and thank you to everyone who has bought a copy. Hope you enjoyed it. And everyone who hasn't bought a copy, well, if you're interested in naval history and you want a good read about the genesis of the modern destroyer in the Royal Navy, I know I'm the author, I know I'm biased. I'm shameless about being biased. I think it's a good book. And I promote the book for 3 reasons. 1, nice to get some money back. It might eventually pay for the pictures that I had to buy to put in it. The rights might eventually pay for that. Who knows? Secondly, I'm an academic, a British academic, and promotions, hiring, everything seems to be based on book sales, not anything else in terms of teaching ability. Book sales. So, no one else is going to do advertising? I might as well advertise it myself. And thirdly, because I love it. I spent days of my life doing this. Years doing it, actually, and cumulatively. It outlived the relationship. A pretty good one. One I thought might actually go the full way, but didn't. It spanned 2 standard poodles. Unfortunately, when it started, we had Mozart. When it finished, we had Raleigh. And through it all, I kept going back to it and kept moving on with it because it needed to be written. That's the only way I can describe it. And it needed to be written because, in my mind, it needed to be read. Because there's no point writing something which doesn't need to be read. It's kind of like saying words which don't need to be spoken. It's a waste of energy. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of life. Which is why being rude about people never makes anything better. And yes, if you haven't realised, before I finish the book plug, there is a cat walking around our front garden in the night. And I can tell this for 2 reasons. 1, they keep setting off the light and walking past my window. And 2, you can't hear it, hopefully, because of the microphone and the various measures taken, but there is an extremely irate corgi currently locking eyes with that cat from a window. Very annoyed, the cat is walking past his bedroom while he's trying to sleep. For the cat's sake, we are all very glad the corgi cannot get out in the garden. At the moment, he could be working on a cunning plan. So World War II begins. Let's consider what point the submarine service were in when World War II began. I say point because one of the things that's often thrown at the Royal Navy submarine service is that until 1940, well, mid-1940 roughly, they're not all under orders only to engage any warships. This makes them like the Japanese. Not quite. Okay? The reason the submarines are under orders to engage enemy warships only, or at least focus on enemy warships only, and some of them do not always behave and follow those rules, twofold. One, the Royal Navy prior to that decision made to allow the submarines to go free, has a rather active armed merchant cruiser contingent, plus a fair number of destroyers and cruisers themselves, and one battleship trying to get involved at certain points, hoovering up the world of enemy merchant ships so that they are available for the British to use. Remember, this is a Royal Navy operating on the basis that it's going to be fighting a high-tech version of World War I at some point from a submarine perspective. Anti-submarine warfare perspective. And yes, they have ASDIC, so they can rely on that, and they think, and all these things, but they're also thinking they're going to lose merchant vessels, so they want to capture as many enemy merchant ships as they can. There's also the point that in that sort of period, the British are doing their very best to A, build and gather allies, and B, and this is important, to minimize blue-on-blue losses, i.e. losses to their own side, their own allies, until everything is worked out so there is clear signals and clear systems in place to try and prevent that. Nothing's ever going to be totally successful in this scenario. You're never going to have 100%, but getting as close to it as you can humanly possible with the technological availability as it is important. So all this means is that the British basically go, right then, for the first few months of the war, we know you're raring to go, we know you're very keen on going, we know you're incredibly motivated to go and start doing nasty things. We support you in your desire to do this. However, we'd like you to not aim for these targets, but instead report their positions. And something of your surface brethren, whatever's closest and available, will go and accost them. And hopefully acquire them, should that be the opportunity. That's the criteria. And that's not a bad thinking. Yes, you could say, well, you know, if they sink them, then that takes them from the enemy. It does. But also means you don't gain. If you can capture them, then the enemy goes down one and you go up one. It's advantageous. And during the earlier phases of operations, it doesn't run a lot of risks. Especially while you're just in a war versus Germany. Again, Germany is not that big a threat as far as the Navy is concerned at that point. It has the potential to be, but let's be honest, in 1939 the German Navy is tiny. Yes, it's building a lot. Yes, it's got a lot of potential there. Yes, it's got a lot of interesting technology going on and it's got some growth and skills. But actually in 1939, the German Navy, as a proportion of navies in the world, is definitely one of the smallest. There is a reason why, in terms of balanced fleet capability, Germany ranks 3 out of three of them are the three major Axis powers, with Italy beating it and being probably the strongest naval power on the Axis forces until Japan joins. So, British policy makes sense at the beginning of the war. There are still submarines which like to get around that, and one of the advantages the British find very quickly is that their torpedoes do work. They have been thoroughly tested, and they do work. Now, before anyone starts thinking this is a dig at the other nations, no it isn't. The Royal Navy had had submarines not work on them before. This is one of those institutional memory, cultural memory things. And same with damage control and various other things. I've talked about how paranoid the Royal Navy is about fire aboard aircraft carriers. Well, it's the same with torpedoes. The Royal Navy had been through the issue with torpedoes. They'd had the dud shells as well issue in World War I. And both of those things combined had meant that in the 1920s and 30s, when other services around the world were scaling back due to cost-cutting on their testing, the Royal Navy was finding interesting and creative ways to fund testing of their weapons systems to make sure they worked. And that's one of the reasons why, when you get to World War II, especially in the early phase, the British weapons that are in use and are very successful have all been thoroughly tested. It's almost disturbingly well tested. That you can make the case that some of them are not really that innovative or that, super modern, but you can't really say they're not capable, and you can certainly not say they're not tested. This gives British submarines a slight advantage over their counterparts of many nations, in that when they fire their torpedo, as long as they have set everything up right or close to right, the torpedo will hit, if it should hit its target, will do what it's supposed to do most of the time. There is again no 100%. There is always the opportunity of something to go wrong. But broadly speaking, when World War II begins, the Royal Navy, its submarine service, is sitting there very pretty, very happy, feeling very capable, and rightly so. So let's consider HMS Truant, and by the way, this is not a picture of Truant, this is a picture of her target. This is the Karlsruhe. Yes, the German light cruiser. The Karlsruhe was the first kill for the Truant, which, as I mentioned, rather belies its name with its nature. It does turn up where it's supposed to, on time and in the right place. But it's part of an overall campaign policy of the Royal Navy to make Operation Wurstbung as expensive for the Germans as it could. And it had the perfect tools for this. The T-class are ambush predators to a T. And I mean that in more than the pun sense. They were designed, especially the first ones, to fire a spread of 10 torpedoes. Now again, the British have got duplex torpedoes, and they do have their own run of interesting things. But they were far more tested and had far more of their kinks worked out than pretty much any other torpedo system in the world at that time. And let's be honest, the Royal Navy should have done that, because they had the most opportunity to do that, and the most funding to do that, and the most support and mature programs to do that with. And they had people who were demanding that of them. So, yeah, if it wasn't, there's a problem. Now, the Karlsruhe was being escorted back by 3 Type 23 torpedo boats. That's called torpedo boats, but they're realistically small destroyers. To an extent, I suppose they're sort of like the Speakers, but they actually are armored torpedoes. But they all displace less than 1,000 tons in standard and only 1,300 tons in deep load. So they're not big vessels, but They're small destroyer-sized vessels, really. Anyway, she leaves Kristiansand on the 9th of April. And she has 3 of these Type 23s as escorts, as said. Unfortunately, she's going out of fjord, and fjords are kind of predictable where you're going to go out of. So the Royal Navy has a submarine stationed at the end of the fjord going, hello, this submarine is Trunt. And she fires a salvo. She fires a full salvo. Karlsruhe takes evasive action, but let's be honest, that's quite a heavy salvo coming her way, and one of those torpedoes strikes starboard side amidships, and it makes a very large hole in the hull, which not only starts to flutter herself, but the flooding itself disables her engines and electrical generators. Now, this is a poor design feature. If your electrical generators and your backup generators are all designed in a place where it can be flooded, you've got a problem. Now, you might go, well, hang on, and it wouldn't have been flooded if they'd been hit elsewhere in the vessel. That's true. But this is one of the points I make about German design quite often. They're still learning and remembering the experience because of the Treaty of Versailles, because of the institutional memory loss caused by that. They are still relearning some of the lessons, and some of the lessons are to do with damage control. They're quite literally, oh, frigate, we need to have backup somewhere above deck. It might sound obvious, but it isn't, because if you think about it from safety perspective, from fighting an enemy action, yeah, in the hull is usually safer. Anyway, what happens to her? Well, the flooding, as I said, disables her pumps, her engines, and she can no longer deal the oncoming water. So there's no chance to save her. So they decide to abandon her after 2 hours. She does hold up for that long, which is good. A good design mark of her buoyancy and her residual buoyancy. And then it's the Grief, which is a Type 23 torpedo boat. Takes off the crew and fires 2 more torpedoes into the Karlsruhe to scuttle her. There are a lot of people who put the view that, the fact it took 2 extra torpedoes to sink her and all this, it would have been possible to tow her back to Kristiansand or another port. And it was argued that the forward pump still had power, and so the flooding could have been slowed enough to permit a return to safe harbour. That comes pretty much word for word from translation from the official report. But I would say this. There was a lot of water going in her. These ships do not have a lot of bulkheads. Her stability and the ability to control her safely are very limited with what she was dealing with. And so, yeah, I understand why they didn't and why they took the action they did. And she carried on. A Trunt carries on. She has, well, how to put it? She almost sinks the Ulster, which is a British merchant vessel, which had been captured by the Germans, but her torpedoes missed. Even if your torpedoes work when they hit, they don't always hit. She intercepted the Tropic Sea. The Tropic Sea was scuttled by the German prize crew in the Bay of Biscay, and so Trunt took aboard the Norwegian crew and various other people aboard and got them to safety. And quite a lot of Norwegians were also rescued by flying boats, which were called in by the Trunt. And she almost was sunk by HMS Clyde, who mistook her for an enemy submarine at one point, but Clyde's torpedoes missed. And Clyde, of course, was a River-class submarine. She has then experience in the Mediterranean, and these include vessels like the Providenza, the Sebastiano, the Bianca, the Multido, and the tankers, the Bonzo and Meteor, and a subchaser called the Vanna, and plus the Balangasi and the Virginia S. Truant. She has a fairly good career in the Mediterranean. She unsuccessfully attacks a few ships as well, but, that's life. You are trying to make attacks which you are going to succeed with, but you won't always succeed. The enemy has a vote, so does occasionally Lady Luck. They all have votes. Then she goes to the Far East in 1942. And, well, during that, she again sank some ships. The Yeimaro and the Shunsei Maro in the Malacca Strait. She came very close to sinking another liner, but she decided that they had hospital markings. It's possibly the Hikawa Maro, but they're not quite sure, and so they decided not to sink her. And she sank the Taman Maro, which was a Japanese army cargo ship, in a gun battle. Because, well, you know, she felt like it, I presume. And she eventually returns home from the Far East to have her engine troubles dealt with, because she's starting to develop engine issues. All the hot water, all the stuff going on, that's caused her trouble. But her refit takes her into 1943, and then she's part of the Hunt for Tirpitz, and eventually she's sent back to the Far East, but her engine troubles flare up again out there, so she's sent home again, and yeah, she ends up being used as a trial ship for snorkel tests and things in 1945 before being sold for scrap in December 1945. She has a good career. A hard career. If you consider she is launched in 1939, having been laid down in 1938, she packs in almost 2 times around the world, and sold for scrap in 1945. I know, the postie sir. And broken up, well, actually wrecks under tow in December 1946. She packs a lot into 7 years of life. But she's a good ship, good boat. Now, the Deutschland, of course, by the point at which it's actually damaged by HMS Spearfish, renamed the Lutzow because, well, there's 2 reasons. One, the Germans were trying to an extent, hide the sale of the Lutzow, the Admiral Hipper class cruiser, to the Soviets. They didn't. The British worked it out fairly quickly. The Allied intelligence was pretty on the ball when it came to German shipping, and kind of obsessive as well. And secondly, someone had realised that, hang on, okay, yes, she was kind of saved on her patrol in the Atlantic by the fact she only sank 2 ships and captured a 3rd during her mission. So she didn't exactly stick out much as a surface raider. But if we lost the ship named Germany to the Royal Navy, that would have been a propaganda victory. The Royal Navy would not have stopped crowing about out for at least the next 100 years. I mean, you think the Battle of the River Plate gets a lot of press. Imagine what sinking of the Deutschland would have got. The day the Royal Navy sank Germany. I can see the movie now, in Technicolor. Yeah, it would probably be a modern retelling of it where there'd be a plucky American CIA agent or something involved, even though the CIA didn't exist at that time. You could just see it now. So yeah, they decided to rename the ship, and let's be honest, it did come close. There was HMS Repulse and HMS Furious wandering around at several points, not that far away from it. Far enough it didn't get caught, but not so far they didn't feel that they felt particularly safe. Well, they would have felt particularly safe if they realised they were there. It's one of those scenarios where, luckily, the British didn't know they were there, and to be honest, it's possibly lucky the Germans didn't know the British were there, because if the Germans had known the British were there, they might have done something like crack on full speed in an opposite direction, which would kind of made them stick out. The fact that they just behaved like they were normal shipping probably was what helped them, and they did that because they didn't realise there was quite such a scary combo nearby. And in 1939, early 1940, HMS Repulse and HMS Furious together are a scary combo. Anyway, she's actually damaged in April 1940. Again, it's part of the Royal Navy making Operation Versprung as costly as possible. As far as they're concerned, the Kriegsmarine should be paying for this for years. And this is a perfect example of doing that, because the thing is, she gets damaged in 1940. She's not back in service till May 1942, realistically, including subsequent damage and some of the issues which come up with her returning in service. So she's taking up yard space, she's taking up material, she's taking up focus and funding for 2 odd years to fix her and get her back in service. That's what the Royal Navy really wants. Sinking a ship is great. It takes it completely off the board. But damaging a ship, it's going to turn into a harbour queen for the next 2 years, and you can keep bombing it and keep causing the Germans to have to devote resources to it while not building anything else or be able to do anything else. That's a real win. That, for a small navy, is an incredibly large cost. Again, if we're talking about the Karlsruhe earlier, honestly, you could argue that the captain who said, right then, this ship is just not worth it, and looking at some of the German light cruisers you can agree with, to try and rebuild, let's just sink it here, was making a very sensible decision for the German naval economics. Although I doubt they'd have listened to that argument. So, the Lutzow, as she was called by the point at which she's hit. What happens to her? What causes her to suddenly have this disturbing experience? Well, she runs into HMS Spearfish. Never a good scenario. It's an S-class submarine. The Royal Navy S-class are kind of famous. They were designed to be nasty in nasty places. That was literally their entire purpose. The Royal Navy had sort of 3 levels of submarine. I'll be talking about this as this goes on. The U-class, the S-class, and the T-class. T-class are the very big ambush predators. They're designed to go places a long way away from the UK and position themselves with their torpedoes and go, come here. The U-class are sort of inshore, shallow waters, Mediterranean specialists. They are designed to be sleek, fast, nimble, and the perfect threats in those kinds of waters. The S-class are the Royal Navy's attempts to build something of an all-rounder. It's not going to be the best in either of those categories, but it's going to be good enough in the middle. And scarily enough, they get it just right. The S-class is one of the most lethal submarines in World War II. If you look at their kill rate for targets, they intercept, and actually they hit, they are one of the best performing classes of submarine in World War II, bar none. One of the best. And, well, in this case, she's waiting for Lutzow. Quite simply. That is her purpose. Rather like, again, Truant was with Karlsruhe, Spearfish is waiting for Lutzow. In one of the most silly decisions known to mankind, they decided to leave their torpedo boats, that's Type 23 star vessels, behind, and to use their speed of 24 knots to try and avoid the submarines. Unfortunately for them, Spearfish was on 11th April sitting pretty much perpendicular to her route of advance and was able to just go pop, pop. She fired a spread. A torpedo hit the Lutzow's stern, causing it to collapse, and pretty much probably would have been better for the ship if it had fallen off. It might have made it less difficult to repair because you just put on a new one, not tried to fix it. This meant that they were unable to steer the vessel, and so they had to call for others to assist them to tow her back to port, and she actually ended up being fully decommissioned for the repairs because they took so long. And then, once she's in dry dock, did the British ignore her? No! At this point, that's handing over the job to the Royal Air Force, who go, "Oh, goody, bombing target." And the Royal Air Force turn up on a fairly regular basis over Kiel to Make sure their presence is understood, and their views on the nature of Lutzow returning to service anytime soon are properly explained in high explosive. Now, they don't always manage to score any hits, but that doesn't really matter for disrupting it. She's a focal point for their energy, for their efforts, and so she gets the full treatment as a focal point for their efforts. So again, this is something which is often not considered when we talk about ships and submarines and their value in war. You also have to have a value for that vessel. At what point is it worthwhile repairing? A good example again is look at the Royal Navy and the US Navy. During World War II, there are lots of ships of theirs which are damaged. At a certain point, some of those are written off. It's considered more economical to just bring in a new ship. And that value judgment can change depending on the point of the war you're in, and depending on how long they think it's going to take. If you're later in the war, when you have more ships around, honestly the threshold for what's a write-off is going to be a lot lower than earlier in the war when you've got a crash building program going and the war started 3 years before you were supposed to be ready for it. For smaller navies, that criteria never gets to the point where they can really write things off, or truly afford to. They still have to sometimes, but they don't want to. And this is where the U-class really come in. Okay, I'm starting the submarine profiles with the smallest to the largest. The U-class come in a couple of different generations, and truly are the Mediterranean assassins. That's what they were designed for. They were designed to provide the Royal Navy with a punch in certain key waters and to not require much tonnage. Because again, unfortunately, there were cumulative tonnage limitations for quite a long time on submarines. This meant you had to be careful how many submarines you had, what you had. One of the interesting things is that the actual agreement went that the US Navy, the Royal Navy, and the IJN were allowed the same cumulative tonnage of submarines. That's an interesting bit of history if you consider the treaty limitations and the views of everyone of submarines, and yet the thing that the Japanese are allowed to have equivalency of with the two major powers under the treaty system are submarines. One can argue it was the Royal Navy and US Navy recognising the importance of submarines to the Japanese defensive mindset and fighting and their fighting capabilities, but it could also say there is a bit of misunderstanding A of the capability of ASDEC, and B, a little bit too much of a assuredness on the American approach there. There were honestly some who believed that in the 1930s they had already conquered the submarine threat, and submarines were no longer a threat. The realistic piece of history is that new weapons platforms don't go away, they evolve. And that is the reality with submarines. They evolve. Same as aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, all these things evolve. Now with the U-class, they are small. And I know I keep saying that, but it's worthwhile thinking about it. To put this in perspective, the O-class, which are a post-World War II design from about 1950s, built and commissioned 1960s to 2000s, and which served in a lot of navies. The Royal Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, I think the Royal Canadian Navy, the Brazilian Navy, and the Chilean Navy, and were looked at by many others. There are roughly a dozen of those in preservation that you can go wander around, including one at Chan Dockyard and one in Australia, a couple in Australia actually. They displace 2,000 tons on the surface, 2,400 tons submerged. The U-class submarines, well, they start out at 550 tons. on the surface normally. They do grow, some are larger, and they get up to 640 tons, and usually roughly 730 some tons for the larger ones submerged. In simple terms, therefore, they're about a third to a quarter of the size of an Oberon, which is the normal one you can go for a wander through if you find yourself in Chatham Dockyard or somewhere else in the UK to see a preserved submarine. They are small. And as I said, they are designed. They are entering service in 1938. There is an argument, some would say they're designed as training vessels, but to be honest, it's kind of like HMS Unicorn is not an aircraft carrier. She's a forward aviation support ship that turns out to be the template model for the light fleet carriers. You just take out the forwards aviation support heavy engineering plant and just leave her as she is, and she's an aircraft, a light fleet carrier. Well, calling U-class training submarines, it's kind of ignoring the fact that everything's being designed to make them as nimble and as light as possible and easy to produce as possible. They're also designed to be as smooth hulled as possible. The Royal Navy spends a lot of time looking into the aerodynamics, well, not aerodynamics, the hydrodynamics, sorry, of their shape and how effectively they'll perform in the water. They want to make them the best submarines they can make them, and they really do a good job. If you're in a U-class boat, you've got a very high chance of going up country, i.e. going towards the threat. You've got a good chance of succeeding, and you've got a fairly good chance of getting back. Now, why do I say a fairly good chance? Well, here are the odds. There are 49 of the class built in World War II. 20 were lost. So, 40%, roughly? That's fairly good odds for wartime. Admittedly, there was one boat which was lost and then raised again, so you're not sure which category to put that in. But they do a good job. And from Malta, they are a dominant force, although they often have to be very careful about their usage of torpedoes, because torpedo supply to Malta is not always the most reliable. So they can get fuel, but getting torpedoes, and so therefore they have to be sure they're going to get a kill, or at least sure they have a good chance of hitting their target before they actually fire, which means they are aggressive in their tactics to try and close the enemy, but cautious in their firing habits, which makes for a very interesting battle during the Mediterranean. It really does. And well, let's give you another history of a boat, HMS Splendid. Appropriately just Splendid. So why just Splendid? Well, she's laid down in March 1941. She's launched, so that's when we consider her born in terms of ship years, in January 1942. She's commissioned in August 1942. She scuttled after being depth charged in April 1943. So she's a little over a year old, and let's be honest, not that many months in service in actual commission. And in that time, she manages to account for the Sao Paulo, the Favorita, the Avia, which was a destroyer, one of the important fleet destroyers of the Italian Navy, the very rare and special vessels, the Emma, the Cleopatra, which I think was an armed trawler sunk with gunfire, the Commercio, the XXI April, which was a merchant vessel, the Tivoli, and the Giorgio. Why am I having trouble with the Giorgio? I have no idea. She was a very active vessel. She did all that on pretty much 2 patrols. 2 patrols. She's the third Royal Navy vessel to bear the name Splendid. And when she arrives at Gibraltar on the 16th of October, she is quickly turned around, being sent out to patrol off the coast of Toulon on the 31st of October. She has trouble with her driving planes though, has to return home. And so she departs again on the 7th of November, again heading towards Toulon. And then she's sent to operate off Naples instead. And on the 16th of November, she fired 6 torpedoes at a German U-boat. Probably a U-boat. The conning tower designs between the German vessels and the Italian vessels are different enough that we can be fairly certain it probably was one of the German U-boats which were operating in the Mediterranean at this point. But it's still worthwhile thinking about the fact that there were quite a lot of Italian subs around. And at this point, though, the conning towers are different enough in design that, especially submariners, you would expect to be able to tell the difference. And deciding that, frankly, her torpedoes were obviously not lucky that day, she decided to sink the Sao Paulo, an anti-submarine schooner, with gunfire instead. And then she fired her 6 remaining torpedoes, after all she'd fired 6 at their U-boat, at the Italian submarine, the Aradam, on 20th of November, and again all missed. She's not having fun trying to torpedo submarines. It's one of the things the Royal Navy will continue doing and trying to do the whole way through World War II, is trying to sink submarines with their own submarines. And they do get good at it, and they do it. But you have to think it's an ongoing criteria, an ongoing mission they keep working on. And, unsurprisingly, therefore, they do earn the only confirmed submarine versus submarine underwater kill. The next day, she came up with a cunning plan, and this is a cunning plan which you really shouldn't do. She has 1 torpedo left, it's in the unreloadable tube aft, and she decides that, okay, I've seen a convoy of merchant ships, I think there's only 1 destroyer escorting it, so I'm going to fire this 1 torpedo at the destroyer. If it sinks it or damages it, then I'm going to surface with my guns and sink the merchant ships. She does this. They do manage to damage the Velite, which was the destroyer involved. Unfortunately, it turns out there are 2 other destroyers there. So she decides to carry on out of there and not hang around. But on the 23rd of November, she managed to encounter the Favorita, which was an Italian merchant vessel, on the northwest coast of Sardinia, and sank her with gunfire, because, as I said, she's out of torpedoes. This is a vessel which doesn't really understand the concepts of, submarine, torpedoes. Anyway, her patrol ends on the 28th of November, she gets home, that's lovely. On the 8th of December, she starts another patrol. This time, she's north of Tunisia. And, well, on the 14th of December, she spots an Italian convoy. She fires 4 torpedoes at it and claims a hit, but sad enough, she claimed a hit. Don't think she actually achieved a hit. But don't worry, the merchant ships in the convoy were sunk by HMS Sahib and HMS Unruffled just a few hours later. The Royal Navy's not letting them get away. On the 17th of December, though, well, she sighted another convoy. This time she fired 6 torpedoes at the Ankara. 1 torpedo went 10 metres in front of the ship's bow, another 30 metres behind the ship's stern. However, 2 torpedoes hit the Italian destroyer the Avia, which she wasn't actually aiming for. And, well, she went down in 10 seconds with 220 dead. So that's a fleet destroyer gone from the Italian fleet. HMS Saracen, one of her sisters, observed the attack and confirmed the sinking. It's always nice when there's another submarine nearby to confirm these things. Then Splendid did her usual trick of, well, I have 1 left, 1 working torpedo left. I've spotted a submarine. Fire! And miss. Splendid's really trying to get a submarine kill here. She's really trying. So far, it's 3 for 0. She hasn't got a single one, but, you know, she's keep going. She's keep going. In January 1943, she starts her patrol off the coast of Sardinia, and then, after she'd been there on the about 4 days, she lands some SOE personnel on Sardinia's eastern coast. She's then ordered to go and patrol off Naples, and upon reaching her new patrol area, has fun, as on the 15th of January, she sights an Italian convoy, fires 5 torpedoes at the Emma, which was transporting 950 tons of supplies and 10 tanks. A single torpedo hit, and the merchant ship was stopped, but didn't sink. However, you know that whole thing where submarines are supposed to attack and then run away so they don't get attacked? No. For some reason, Splendid decided that they were actually going to stay close by. And they decided to attack the ship again in daylight. The Italians tried to tow the Emma, but couldn't. And then the next morning, Splendid launches another torpedo, which sinks the ship. After this, there is a brief counterattack, but let's be honest, they hadn't spotted her all night, just hanging around going, "Hello, I'm watching you." And this is submarine tactics. You're supposed to, you've hit your target, you fire, and then you withdraw so you can become the ambush predator again. Not be the predator sitting on the wall watching going, "You can have a chance to tow, yes. If you get it in tow by the morning, that's going to give me more targets because you won't be able to maneuver." She later sinks a minesweeper, the Cleopatra, already mentioned earlier, but she sinks her with gunfire east of Sardinia because, again, like with the armed trawler Valletta, Splendid does not feel that torpedoes are necessarily the natural and only weapon in her arsenal, and feels very much like she would be happier in World War I, where a gun was the primary system. She relies on her gun. Her gun will not let her down, like every time she tries to torpedo an enemy submarine. Her gun will work for her. And she then also sinks the merchant vessel the Commercio with torpedoes on the 19th of January as well. She returns to Algiers on the 22nd of January, 1943. And, she then departs off for another patrol on the 13th of February. She sighted a nice Italian convoy with merchant vessel, the XXI April, or 21 April, loaded with 300 tons of ammunition, 150 tons of supplies, and 50 vehicles of various types. She sighted it. She sank it. A week later, she spots another Italian convoy. It had been a week between her seeing convoys. She expends the remainder of her torpedoes, but doesn't sink any ships, so she goes back to Algiers again. Then, on the 11th of March, she starts another patrol. This time, she's patrolling north of Sicily. After being there on the 16th of March, she managed to spot the tanker, the Davoli, and then the Georgia on the 20th of March. She ends her patrol on the 28th of March. At this point, her CO, for some reason, gets a Distinguished Service Order. I cannot think why anyone would be granting this man a Distinguished Service Order. And many of her crew are getting meritorious service commendations of various types coming in. Cannot think why after all this. Basically, from November 1942 to April 1943, despite the fact that she seems unable to actually sink an enemy submarine, despite her repeated attempts, she is technically, in total tonnage sunk, the most successful British submarine. Between the invasion of French North Africa, that is Operation Torch, and Axis forces surrendering in Tunisia in May 1943, a critical time. She's the most successful submarine in those waters. Unfortunately, she wasn't around to see that, because in April 1943, she has a run-in with the British-built, for the Greek Navy, now operated by the Germans, destroyer Hermes, aka the Vasilios Georgios, the King George, and which had been in leadership of 2 destroyers built by Yarrow for the Greek Navy. Now, as a British-built destroyer, she's fitted out quite well for anti-submarine warfare operations, and is quite good at it. And she was actually the largest German vessel in the Mediterranean, barring some of their auxiliary minesweepers and some of the, ships which they'd taken out of trade, basically. This vessel makes 3 attack runs, with depth charges, dropping 41 in total. Splendid did her best to try and escape. But the last 11 depth charges seem to have managed to build upon the compounding of the previous 30 depth charges, and leaks start to become obvious inside the pressure hull. And so she's forced to surface. Immediately, the destroyer opens fire with surface guns, which kills 18 of the crew and wounds the commanding officer. The crew still scuttle her, and the crew are taken off to an Italian prisoner of war camp, where, interesting enough, Ian McGaw, who was, of course, her commanding officer, well, he decided he was going to cause trouble in those prisoner of war camps. And his first attempt to escape failed, but his second attempt succeeded. And then he managed to make his way to Switzerland, where, despite having lost, and this was despite having lost the use of one eye, in Switzerland he gets that fixed by getting the metal splinter removed from his eye while he's there, and then is able to travel through France, Spain, and return to Britain, and a return to the Royal Navy. So yeah, she was lost, but let's be honest, she packed a lot into a very short career. She really did pack a lot in. Speaking of other actions which pack a lot into them, we have the sinking of the Ashigara, where the Royal Navy turn up with HMS Trenchant and HMS Stygian, i.e. a T-class and an S-class submarine, and are strictly adopting the policy of, you won't get out of here. They had decryptions of various transmissions telling them exactly where the Japanese were planning on going, and the US commander of submarines Southwest Pacific, Rear Admiral James Fife, was involved. There is something rather interesting at certain points when people start to talk about this one. It's a combined operation. Sometimes they run it as literally as, it was this American commander just running it all. And you go, no, it's a combined op, because the British could provide some submarines and the Americans provided other submarines, and basically the thing was, if they went one way, they'd go into this route, and if they go the other way, they go this route. And it's a combined op. It's not just being run through one office the whole way. There is one very easy way to tell it's a combined op. At this point, there is incredible trouble of trying to get American communication gear to talk to British communication gear when it comes to their submarines. This has actually caused trouble at this point. So, yeah, it has to go through multiple command centers and has to be a combined op. There was actually one book I read where which basically described it as going as Fife directing the submarines where to go and how to maneuver. No one is going to be doing that because that's going to reveal the position of your submarines because it's going to be so much broadcasting. But B, you can't do that. And C, I think I've kind of skipped B, haven't I? C is, the radios wouldn't link up, but B, and this is the most important thing, at no point would James Fife have the time to do that. He's the US Commander of Submarines Southwest Pacific. The man has more important things to do with his time than sit on a radio directing two commanders who should know what they're doing, because they should be used to running their submarines by this point, and if they're not, why are they in charge of them, in telling them how to maneuver their boats. He's busy! I love it when the books are like that. And you just sit and go, what do you think this guy is doing with his life? Do you think the Admiral's just sitting there going, I'm bored, I have nothing to do. No, I'm coordinating the actions of 50 submarines, working with different allied commands with their own submarines, dealing with people above me, dealing with people below me, dealing with MacArthur off to one side of me. And yes, I'm so bored, I have the time to get on the phone and tell fellow submariners how to maneuver their boats, which I have never served on and have completely different command and control procedures than the boats I've trained on. No. No. Just think about it honestly. It's not good. That's not going to happen. Anyway. It's a nice, interesting action. It's technically called the Action the 8th of June by the Royal Navy, but you can call it the sinking of the Ashigara. And it takes place on the 8th of June, 1945, hence the name. The British, by the way, this is one of the truly interesting things about the British and war fighting throughout their history. The number of battles where they just go, we can't be bothered to come up with a name of this. It took place on the 8th of June. Action of the 8th of June. Look, we even gave one. It was supposed to be the action of the 1st of June, and because it was such a great victory, it became the glorious 1st of June. No one can ever say we are not creatively lazy. So, pretty much, they receive various ideas and various scripts about the Japanese operations that the Japanese are manoeuvring. The Japanese have been escorting troops through, have been providing cover, and heavy cruisers are vital for this. Because the presence of a Japanese heavy cruiser means that if you're going to send out a surface force to engage, you need to bring something capable. These are valuable assets, especially with the Japanese being quite so reticent about committing their capital ships. These, in terms of surface engagement, are often the most powerful units that the Allies will see and will face on a regular basis. Therefore, taking them out, reducing their numbers, is of vital importance because it reduces the scope of action available to the Japanese. Ashigara is being escorted by the Kamikaze, a destroyer. Yes, it's a destroyer called the Divine Wind. And again, it was named out a long time before they came up with that particular battle tactic. So the USS Blueback had spotted a departure of Ashigara and Kamikaze from Chikata, but was unable to get into an attack position. And so it posted a contact report. The report is passed to the various other Allied commanders and submarines in the area. Now, this is where things get interesting because there's a very interesting discussion which takes place around this point where usually it's inferred as Fife allows the trenchant to go into the Bancar Strait. This is despite its considered many dangers, currents, trolls, and the presence of an Allied minefield. The Royal Navy accounts basically put it as Commander was proceeding. And Commander proceeded into there because that would have given the best position. Now, there is a thing in the Royal Navy history, and I'm never quite sure whether this directly crosses over to the US Navy because I've been told different things by different US Navy officers. In the Royal Navy, an officer will signal their intentions. And that basically says, this is what I intend to do, and basically, you have to order me not to do this, because otherwise I'm going to do this. So unless you, and you better have a good reason for ordering not to do this, because it's going to go up the chain of command. Now, when an officer signals that, that's code for, we're going to do this. Some of the accounts from the American side seem to take that as him asking for permission That's not. Asking permission is, these are my operational these are my plans, these are my procedures. When a Royal Navy officer says intentions, and again, this is the great thing about the languages and differences. So if Fife had said no, A would have had to go to the British commander who'd already said yes, and, or rather, acknowledge the intentions, which is basically the same as yes as far as the Royal Navy is concerned. And B, you'd have to make sure the submarine commander received it, and honestly, there is always the option for a submarine commander to just go, oh, we didn't receive that signal. But any commander to go, oh, the radio must have malfunctioned, I didn't receive a signal. So, again, maybe the US Navy submariners are different, but in my experience of studying them, I haven't seen much difference. Maybe they would have, if the Admiral had said no, wouldn't have taken the risk to get into position to attack the heavy cruiser. I doubt that somehow. I sincerely doubt that. So, they position themselves in. Trenchant in a lead with Sturgeon supporting it. Trenchant is taking a position on the northern approaches, just inside the Banker Strait, to approximately south of the Hendrik Klibben Shoal, and Sturgeon is to the north of that shoal. Both submarines manoeuvred into position on the surface. Now, this was dangerous, but considered most sensible to negotiate the minefield which had been laid by a Dutch submarine, the HMLS 019, a little bit earlier. So this is a truly allied operation. There is a US submarine which didn't get in position but has filled the contact report. There is a Dutch submarine which has filled in a minefield, which is the backstop, and there are the two British submarines which are at the front going, you're coming in our direction. Hello. At 04:23 hours, Kamikaze is sponsored by Trenchant. The destroyer spots Trenchant at 04:36 hours, but opens fire. Trenchant just fires her stern tubes at Kamikaze, and, well, Kamikaze increases speed, torpedo miss, but Trenchant has sent a contact report to Sturgeon, and then she just keeps manoeuvring on the surface. She's basically managing to hide herself in the murkiness of the water in the night. She's not diving, though, for a reason. She's not quite sure where those mines are, and so she'd prefer to not run the risk and to stay on the surface for as long as she can. Now, Kamikaze starts firing star shells. Sturgeon spots her, but Kamikaze heads off in the wrong way, pretty much, and with the support of patrolling Japanese aircraft. It's only at 10:50 hours, 10:50 hours, roughly, that Kamikaze changes course back to the south after heading north, at which point she runs into Sturgeon, who fires 2 torpedoes at her, and Kamikaze again avoids the torpedoes. She tries to depth charge Sturgeon, but just causes minor damage before losing contact. And yeah, they have been successfully distracted. At 11:50 hours, Ashigara is spotted, bearing 177 degrees at a range of 12,000 yards. That's roughly 11 kilometers, 5.9 nautical miles, or 6.8 regular miles, depending on what kind of distance currency you want to work in. Heading on a bearing of northwest on a course of 330 degrees at a speed of roughly 15 knots. So, fairly mundane speeds as far as ships are concerned. Trenchant didn't close the range. She assumed Ashigara would come closer to her to take the more open water to the east of the shoal, but instead the heavy cruiser decided to pick the restricted water west of the shoal. This is closer to the Sumatra coast. This potentially should protect her from submarines unless a submarine is prepared to do something really, really nutty. This meant that the commander of Trenchant knew that he wasn't getting any closer. In fact, he would not reach a firing position closer than 4,000 yards. Maximum range is torpedoes. And so, at 12:09 hours, Trenchant fires 8 torpedoes, a full bow salvo, from roughly 30 degrees of the cruiser's starboard beam at a range of a little over 4,000 yards. Aimed to hit somewhere in terms of a quarter of a length ahead to a quarter of a length astern. Now, the problem for the Ashigara at this point is, because they've chosen the passage they've chosen, they haven't got room to maneuver. If they dash through at high speed, which again, it's a tight passage you can't really do, they might have had a better chance, because they'd have been through and gone before they could have been, a calculation could have been properly arranged. But all they can really do is a slight change of course to starboard and increasing speed to 20 knots. And their aim was to try and comb the torpedo tracks. That is when you run between them. So if the torpedoes are coming this way, you try and turn into. It's a maneuver which, if you do Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts or World of Warships, you'll be used to, you're familiar with. You can't usually do it in World of Warships due to the engagement range, but Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, it's often a maneuver which, if you've watched me do any of my videos on a Sunday on Twitch or when they're recorded on here, you will notice I do it a lot. And it's usually quite an effective maneuver if you're at a certain range. If you've got range that the torpedoes are split up wide enough you can get through them. Unfortunately, though, that's not the case. And there are troops on deck watching the torpedoes coming in, and 3 minutes after firing, 5 torpedoes strike Ashigara on the starboard side. 1 under the aft tunnel, 1 near the bow, 1 amidships, and 2 more managed to plunge through into various parts of her. Her bow's blown off, the forecastle is smashed, and the ship's completely set on fire from end to end. Can't really say from stem to stern at this point because the stem isn't quite there. Trenchant's crew actually take turns viewing through the search periscope, but it's seen and fired on by the Ashigara's anti-aircraft gunners. It's good to know that those guns were actually put to some use at some point, aiming at Trenchant's periscope, but they also tried to fire torpedoes at the target that was her periscope, and those missed. Kamikaze returned and depth charged the position roughly 3 miles from where the Trenchant was, so it would have probably been better trying to pick up more personnel from the Ashigara herself. As it was, 100 of her crew and 1,200 of her passengers, the soldiers aboard her, would go down with her. 850 crew roughly survived, and 400 of the soldiers. And that can be put down entirely to the fact of where they were. The soldiers were mostly on deck, and when the fire went through the ship, it ravaged the deck. Combine that with capsizing, and yeah, they were not in a good position. They were really not in a good position. The big thing, though, with her loss, you also have the loss of the Haguro to Royal Navy destroyers a little over a month earlier, also in the Malacca Straits area. And that meant there were now no more heavy cruisers, and the vital units which the Japanese had built most of their operations around were gone. So that meant that the Japanese force combining in that area was now minesweepers, some small ASW ships, and various landing craft mostly. It was an individual loss, but it's a big strategic kill. It matters a lot to the Royal Navy and the other Allied forces in the area. And that brings us to a little bit of a profile of the S-Class. Now, I will say I've done profiles on all these submarines before in previous videos, so I am doing generic ones, but you can go and find on the channel profiles of the submarines. Now, as said before, the S-Class are the sort of all-rounder subs. Specifically, they're often covered as being developed for the Mediterranean and North Sea. More for the basin areas of the Mediterranean than for the inshore waters, and definitely for the more shallow waters of things like the straits around Malta, etc. But what they really are backstops. They are the all-rounder submarines. They're there to support things like the U-Class and their predecessors and their eventual successors, the V-Class, in their work. They're there to support the T-Class, and they're there to take a lead in waters like the North Sea, where you pretty much need a vessel which is quite good at some shallow water work, but also capable of doing the deeper water work, can carry a decent enough load of torpedoes, but also can be, how do I put this, built in sufficient numbers, whether under treaty limits or under the limits of your own infrastructure. Okay, we often think about infrastructure as being almost this nebulous thing, but, you know, what yards do you need to build it? Yards you need to build a large submarine, yards you need to build a large warship. All these things can add up. In pretty much terms, when you're talking about yards and their capacity, it can also depend on your process of construction. For example, if you're the British, quite a lot of the heavy armour, etc., as construction is put on in the fitting out yard, not in the construction yard. So there's going to be a difference in process in yards who build the heavy armour into the ship. If your design process builds the heavy armour into the ship internally, as with Nelson Rodney, for example, which were other British battleships, then you have to make sure the yard has the facilities to manoeuvre that armour and position it as you would want to position it. So you probably don't want to have to rely on a tandem lift for that, i.e. two cranes doing the lift together. You want to probably have a single lifting point so you can more easily manage it and more easily control the lift. But if you are just putting the armour on the outside, you can use fitting out yards for that, and that's pretty much what the British do with the King George V and other battleships after that. So, it's the same with submarines. There are certain yards which can deal with doing large submarines with the pressure vessel, the pressure hulls and all the other systems that they require for that. There are other yards which can focus on the medium-sized submarines, and there are still some yards which can do the small submarines. And yeah, you might in peacetime want to focus entirely on the specialist yards which really do good work with submarines, Barrow, Furnace, etc. But in wartime, when you want to maximise your yards, you want to be able to hit every single level. The same thing happens with escorts. There's a reason why the Royal Navy keeps producing corvettes after they've come with frigates, and they've also got sloops. Why? Because different yards can produce to different levels. Some of the merchant civilian yards can actually produce almost war-capable ships, so they can do frigates. Some still can't, so they're best with corvettes. And some can produce war-capable vessels. They're best. Then you want to have the sloops go to them. And what do we mean by a war-build warship? We're talking about the level of internal shaping, how the subdivision is structured, how things are structured to make the things more survivable. So basically, a sloop is going to be a far more survivable asset as a rule than a same-sized frigate or a same-sized corvette. Just is because of the way it's going to be constructed. So S-Class are pretty much middle of the road. And they are built to make use of the middle of the road yards. They're built to maximise British infrastructure and British capability when it comes to submarine construction. And maximise it whilst also allowing the fact that there's going to be a lot of other things built. The British aren't just going to be building submarines, they're going to be building a lot of things alongside them, so they want to make sure they're getting the most out of each unit they're constructing for the role they're constructing it. These submarines can slot into many missions. They can be used for Special Forces operations, insertions. They can be used for their own intelligence gathering missions. They can be used as an attack stalking submarines. They are a very versatile asset. And in many ways, I would often argue that submarine hull design especially for the Royal Navy, owes a lot to the U-class and their development. But submarines' operation design, and especially the approach to modern submarines, owes a lot to the S-class. Those are the two sort of scenarios. The T-class, I would love to say they have a big impact on submarine design, but honestly, if you look at the number of torpedoes, the time it's taken to fit them with dedicated VLS and all the other VLS systems for TALAMs, tactical land attack missiles, for things like Tomahawk, etc., the T-class, no. It's the S-class and it's the U-class which have really been the things which whose experiences which have driven post-World War II into modern British submarine design. And speaking of U-class, well, here is HMS Upholder. And this comes from the Admiralty Annals Lost. Such was the standard of skill and daring set by Lieutenant Commander Wanklyn and the officers and men under him, that they and their ship became an inspiration not only to their flotilla, but to the fleet of which it was part, and to Malta, where for so long HMS Upholder was based. That's an interesting statement to make about a vessel when it's lost. Let's be honest, the Royal Navy, when they make announcements, especially in wartime, about ships being lost, they don't usually make such glowing references to their histories. They don't normally talk about them in such long terms. They just usually announce their loss. Basically, we're sorry for their loss, sort of thing. But that's a fairly glowing description. She was commanded for her entire career by Wanklyn. She was laid down in October 1939. She was built by Vickers Armstrong and Baron Furness. She's launched in July 1940. She's commissioned October 1940. And she's lost in April 1942. So she achieves, well, let's be honest, about 20 months of service. 540 tons on the surface and standard displacement. 630 tons full load. 730 tons submerged. She's a good little vessel. She would have the record of sinking the Antonietta Laura of Italy, the Arcturus, a freighter of Nazi Germany, the Leverkusen, a Nazi Germany freighter again, the Conte Rossa, troop ship, killing 1,297 men aboard her. The Laura C, which was an Italian freighter, the Antonia, Italian freighter, the Lucian, a Navy transport, Neptunia, another troop ship, which, well, how to put it, she sank both Neptunia and the Oceania at the same time, and they lost between them 384 men dead. 5,400 odd people were saved, but let's be honest, they've just been through a sinking, so they're not going to be really tip-top condition for a few weeks. She sunk the Libercio, which was a destroyer, one of the Mistral class destroyers. Again, a fleet unit. She sunk the Amiraglio Saint-Bon, a submarine. So she achieved what Splendid kept trying to achieve, but failed. She sank the Tembien, a freighter. She sank the Tricerio, another submarine. And the Maria. Roughly 93,000 gross registered tons of vessels she sunk. Roughly. She had a career and a half. She completed 24 patrols on behalf of 10th Flotilla based out of Malta. And that was where she served her entire career. Wanklyn earned a VC for her service. And she was probably one of the finest submarines the Royal Navy had in service in the Mediterranean or anywhere in World War II. There's a reason why the most recent class of SSKs, that's diesel submarines built for the Royal Navy, were called the Upholder class. It's because they were seeking to honour this vessel and her standing. Perhaps the best way of measuring her worth and value is the fact that how she was lost is still disputed. We haven't realistically found the wreck yet. We have been looking for a long time to try and figure it out, and there are various hypotheses put forward. There are some which I am doubtful of, although they could be a cumulative factor. There is part of me which thinks that there is one theory which is an air attack theory, and I wonder if the air attack damaged her and then the vessel, which was traditionally thought to have taken her, damaged her, sank her. There's also the potential that she was lost in a minefield making to the area she was being tasked to go to. That is a possibility, although there seems to be some sort of report of a sighting of vessel, which, if true, if there was a submarine sighted at that point, would mean it was probably unlikely that she'd made it through the minefield. But again, that sighting is one source. And if someone is spotting something, if someone is seeing it visually, how correct are they? You know, we always talk about, in criminal cases, the issue of trusting eyewitness testimony and the fact that people with different perspectives can see different things, and how much information they really take in, how much do they remember. All we know is that she was ordered to meet up with 2 other submarines to attack a convoy, and she didn't make it. We don't think she made it. She could have been she might have run into the convoy's escorts while trying to get to the meeting point. We don't know that. There are lots of attacks, there are lots of anti-submarine operations going on that day, and so there are lots of potential options for people to draw from. But there's also quite often the chance that you are attacking dolphins. It's one of those realities of war that in peacetime you have all these judgments going, we will make sure of this target before we engage. We'll make sure of this target before we engage. And then in wartime, we think there's an enemy submarine there. Fire. Because if in doubt, it's better to take the risk of not firing at a submarine than to take the risk of not firing at a submarine. It's better to take the risk of firing at something but it's not a submarine than not firing and it turning out to be a submarine. That's the reality. It's always better to have tried to hit the submarine, because the submarine is a threat. School of dolphins, not a threat. But if you mistake a school of dolphins for a submarine, that's not good for the wildlife. It's not something you want to do. But it's better than you mistaking a submarine for a school of dolphins and finding yourself with some torpedoes in you. And let's be honest, with Upholder around, you want to edge on the side of making sure you hit that potential target. She's been a bit too successful for you not to. But thinking about the U-class, there's also the class which follows onto them, which basically takes all lessons of the U-class and all its designs in terms of hydrodynamic performance and turns them into the V-class. And the V-class are some very good submarines, and they're coming out at the end of the war for the Royal Navy, and they take part in the only known hunter-killer that has been delivered. HMS Ventura is the only submarine which is confirmed to have killed another submarine underwater. Other times they've torpedoed submarines on the surface, they've had gunfights with submarines on the surface, they have sunk them with mines, they've done all sorts of weird and crazy things to each other, submariners, but this is the only time a submarine has, we have confirmed and it's openly accepted, torpedoed another submarine underwater. The sinking of U-864. And pretty much U-864 was exactly what it sounds like. It was a Type 9 vessel carrying out Operation Caesar, heading for Japan with all sorts of materials aboard it. And the Royal Navy put submarines in the way with the plan that they would take him out. There was layers and layers of resources in the way to stop these boats, the German boats, reaching Japan. Because frankly, they didn't want any help getting to the Japanese. The Japanese were problematic enough on their own without getting any stuff from the Germans, or any more than they already got. Now, the Admiralty basically plotted out where they thought the submarine would go. They thought the submarine would head north, tracking around up Norway, and then would head around the UK, down the Central Atlantic, down Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and try and get into Japan that way. That's their idea of how they would route, and it worked out that way. So Ventura was on patrol in the Fedge area. That's it. She's just off the coast of, not far from Bergen, really. And at 09:32 hours, and this was on the 9th of February. Sorry, I was going to say 5th of February 1945. 9th of February 1945. No, don't ask me why. 9th of February 1945, 09:32 hours, and their ASDIC operator notes a faint noise. It's very faint, and it comes back 40 minutes later, roughly. Louder. And they spend roughly another 40 minutes spotting for it. And they then spot a thin mast, like a snorkel. Ventura continues to use the hydrophone effect to try and track it. So rather than doing active pinging, they are doing passive work. And this is very, very difficult in this period because it's none of the computers to assist you by filtering noise, nothing. It's literally down to the sonar operator. It's down to the ASDIC operator and their ability to filter our noise. It's entirely down to their capabilities. And the ASDIC operator and the captain take turns listening at certain points, and they track the course of the U-boat, and they realise the U-boat's zigzagging. Now that should have made the U-boat safe as houses, because as I've always talked about on this channel, zigzagging is the thing you most want to be doing in a scenario where there's submarines present. To avoid torpedoes, you want to zigzag, because it makes it most difficult to get to track you. But the thing is, Ventura manages to track this vessel U-864 for roughly 3 hours. This means Lieutenant James Launders has to make a decision. Now, Launders is the captain of the Ventura, and this is another thing you have happen during wartime. Very skilled people will come up. People who are naturals at it will come up. They'll go through the training, they'll go through the process, but they're going to give a lot of opportunity, especially with expanding fleet. And you have an advantage at this point. You have some very young, very smart people. So you might not have all the information, but you've been tracking them for 3 hours. You might not have what is traditionally required, and in this case, what is traditionally required for doing this operation, for firing torpedoes and hoping to hit a target, would be time, distance, bearing, and target depth. But he's been tracking them for 3 hours. He's got a choice at this point. He either tries to fire from underwater, or he surfaces, risks them firing at him to recharge his batteries, or loses target lock. And remember, this is an important thing to try and take out. So what does he do instead? Well, he starts providing some estimates. He tries to maneuver into a firing position without creating noise, exhausting the batteries, anything which is going to kill his crew by either revealing the position or running them out of juice. And so they make a load of guesswork. A load of estimated guesswork. It's crew effort. It's the sonar operator, it's the Jimmy, the executive officer, it's Launders. And then they fire all 4 of their bow torpedo tubes. And then dive to avoid U-864's expected retaliation. They were fired with a 17.5 second delay between each of the pairs and at slightly different depths. U-864 did manage to try to evade it. It heard torpedoes coming, but lacked maneuverability at this point. It takes time to retract a snorkel. It takes time to disengage diesel and start the electric motors. It takes time to sort out all these things. And remember, they've been happily cruising along for the last 3 hours, feeling they were fine. Probably longer than that. Who knows where they are? They're on snorkel. No one knows them. Still, they managed to avoid the first 3 torpedoes. But they steer into the 4th. And U-864 is split in 2 and sinks with all hands. For all that work, Launders gets a bar added onto his Distinguished Service Order. So basically it's a second DSO, but it's the British government cheaping out of ordering a second medal by just adding on a bar. Unsurprisingly, lots of our crew members receive awards as well, because this is an incredible collaborative effort. And it's the only naval engagement which has ever been completely fought underwater. That's resulted in one side sinking the other. That hasn't been the shadowboxing of the Cold War and the various other scenarios and all sorts of messy pieces during the Cold War that we don't really talk about. Because technically no one fired at anyone, but the damage was real. And let's be honest, we've also had ballistic missile submarines, that's submarines armed with ballistic missiles, SSBNs, in terms between the Royal Navy and the French Navy, have played dodgems, or bumper cars, depending on your perspective, which is not good as well. So there have been lots of things underwater, but this is the only time it's confirmed that a submarine has sunk another submarine underwater. So now let's consider the T-class, the big boats of the Royal Navy in World War II. They were, how can I put this politely? From the get-go, designed to be ambush predators. They were big, capable vessels, focused on the Pacific, you can certainly argue. They were focused certainly on providing the Royal Navy with a capability to take out swathes of enemy forces. The idea was, especially as they were originally constructed, with 6 reloadable bow tubes, 4 external non-reloadable bow tubes, the ability to fire, therefore, 10 torpedoes in a single salvo, as they were originally designed. They're basically designed from the get-go with the idea that if you find an enemy, and they are in a large group, you fire 10 torpedoes into them. They are built around mathematics. Why? Because the Royal Navy did a lot of maths about firing salvos, and they found that if they fired 10 torpedoes, a spread of 10, the odds of them hitting something in a task group go incredibly high. The odds of them hitting something large in a task group go very, very high. Add it the ability to reload 6 more torpedoes and fire 6 more, and things are good. Basically, one of the exercises carried out in the 1930s involved a pair of submarines, theoretically firing 10 torpedoes at a task group, then the one withdrawing, the next one firing 10 torpedoes, then the one which was withdrawn firing 6 torpedoes, and so forth. And basically using the cover and confusion each time they fire torpedoes to cover their draw. The idea not being to sit around and wait to confirm kills, the idea being to cause maximum damage and disruption and then report what's going on. And preferably, if you can draw the enemy into a minefield, which has been laid by one of your sister mine-laying submarines, then that light's even better. Because you'll know the path through the minefield is the hope. Might explain what happened to a certain cruiser earlier, if we start considering these concepts. But pretty much, that's what the T-class are for. Trouble is, being designed with the Pacific and long-range operations in mind, they are also big. They have a bulbous bow for accommodating those extra torpedo tubes. They have all sorts of things included in them which make them unique and special, but also make them not really the sort of boats you want in the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, a lot of them are lost in the Mediterranean because for a certain period during World War II, at the beginning of the war, the Royal Navy was short of submarines. And one of the interesting what-ifs of history is if you've had the U-class ordered earlier, which they could have been, and in numbers earlier, which they should have been, then the T-class boats probably don't get withdrawn from the Far East. Or if they are withdrawn, a significant group are still left in the Far East. And how does that affect things like the invasion of Malaya and Singapore? If the T-class are hanging around, being the ambush predators they are very capable of being. Because it doesn't matter if it's a task group of enemy warships or a task group of enemy troop ships. Firing 10 torpedoes into such a group, that's going to have a significant impact. They were useful submarines, though. They served throughout World War II, throughout all the theatres of World War II, and they acquitted themselves well. Again, though, the Mediterranean is probably where they suffered their heaviest losses, and the Mediterranean was probably where they were least suited, because the S-class are already too big for certain parts of the Mediterranean. It's arguable that the T-class were at the time too big for the Mediterranean. However, that is a nice way to lead us into what is the last submarine and last slide of this video before we get into me discussing and filling admin and explaining why Tuesday's video was late and all that stuff. So that's all to come. I do apologise for that, but that's all to come. And that's of course the slide where today's question is going to be. Umbra is a very special U-class vessel. She has many claims to fame. Many deserved claims to fame. The fact that she survived World War II. She's laid down in July 1940, launched March 1941, commissioned September 1941, and is sold for scrap in 1946. That's good. There's the fact that she manages to sink several vessels during that career. She does a good job. She's a very decorated vessel, but she probably has something which is unique, and I want to end on something which is unique, because the Royal Navy seemed to spend quite a lot of World War II collecting unique accolades. There is the possibility that she shot down an aircraft with her torpedo. Now, if you are shocked by this, don't worry. It is one of those things which is potential, but may not have happened. And whilst there is part of me which would love to go and do the research to verify its truth as best as I can, there's also part of me which doesn't want to, because I kind of like the story. You see, on one of her last patrols, one of her last later actions in the Mediterranean against the Italians, she torpedoes a vessel. The Sulberg. Now, the Sulberg is a roughly 1,700-ton steamer operated by the Germans. She's operating off the Tunisian coastal town of Hammamet at this point. and was carrying a few hundred tons of ammunition, some stores, some artillery pieces, and some vehicles. Being transported from Trapani in Sicily to Susa in Tunisia. They were trying to stave the advance of the Allies at the time. This is December 1942. And, well, she's been escorted by aircraft. There are aircraft over her. Umbra does what U-class submarines do. Spots target. Arms torpedoes. Fires torpedoes. Torpedoes hit Sulborg. And creates a truly massive explosion. A massive explosion. And afterwards, where there had been 3 aircraft escorting 1 freighter, there was no freighter and there were only 2 aircraft remaining. Now, the aircraft were at least 1,000 feet in the air, but we are talking about a large amount of explosives going boom. There is the possibility that an aircraft was taken out. The submarine didn't see any more than that, and honestly, when you read through the limited reports, it does seem unlikely. But it's still up there. And when she came back to port, she flew a Jolly Roger with an aircraft on it, because she'd shot down an aircraft. Yeah, the Royal Navy has fun. So what was today's question? Today's question is this. What do you think of the Royal Navy's plan in up to 1940? Do you think they were right to hold back going into total submarine warfare until they either captured as many enemy merchant ships as they could and while they were sorting out the neutral issue and the convoy issue? Or do you think they should have gone for full-on total war from the get-go and risked blue on blue, risked all the issues and foregone any chance of capturing those enemy merchant ships? I'd love to hear your opinion. I'd love to hear what you think. So, without much further ado, this week was supposed to have super carriers and specialists. They will do. It's just that in the first half of this week, we had a lot of builders around with a lot of heavy tools. And frankly, anything I recorded was just getting the whole time. So it wasn't really any help. So I've tried to get this recorded over today, and hoping it goes up in time. I'm re-recording it because I thought I'd recorded it without any in the background, only to find that even with the doors closed, because there isn't a proper door on this door yet, not yet, the sound of various machinery going in the kitchen got through, and it was far worse than the creaking of the chair. Far, far worse than the creaking of the chair. So hopefully I've done a better job today of keeping the sound out and minimising it. I do apologise if there have been things in it. I do apologise if there has been any shouting or anything going on in the background in it, because honestly, builders around. Everyone's trying to sort out boxes. Everyone's trying to sort out things still, because we're only 3 weeks into this house. It's fun. It is so fun. So the Super Carrier Specialist will hopefully come out Saturday. I'm planning on re-recording it either tonight or tomorrow, depending on how I feel, energy-wise. I'm getting better, but I'm still recovering on the pneumonia front. I now have the October videos in. The patron vote has been in, so I am going to start posting up those, and they're going to go back to the regular schedule of having lives. And I want to say thank you to everyone for being kind, for being helpful and supportive during this process. And thank you to everyone who's helping with the books, because in terms of the bookshelves, with the super chats, everything, all the money coming around is going towards them, because I kid you not, I filled up these two bookshelves, which Drakenfell kindly gave to me. They are the exact type I wanted, the absolutely lovely calyxes, and these two sets of shells took exactly 9 boxes between them. Looking at the boxes I've got on this floor alone, next to me, the pile, I'm talking to that side of me, not the pile behind me, that's at least another 6 sets of shelves. I may have underestimated the number of shelves I need. We'll work on this. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much everyone for your kindness and help, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Again, sorry if it was a bit jumpy in parts. Had doggy woofing at the person who was here today. We've had tradesmen in every day this week. Had doggy woofing at postman when he came in, and of course, also at certain points, I just ran out of energy. Which is terribly annoying, because I'm really enthusiastic about a topic and then my energy just goes, oh. Joy pneumonia. I'm getting over it though. Ah, yes, the Calyx acquisition. What else have we got coming up at some points? We've got a lot. Actually, I'm going to go back again to this one. Coming up next week, we've got Conception, Operation, Conclusion of the Invincible and Kiev classes. That's going to be an interesting comparison. Basically, super carriers and specialists is all about the modern carrier. Which way do you go? Do you go for the full fleet carrier? Or do you go for a specialist carrier? And what's the weighting? And Conception, Operation, Conclusion of the Invincible and Kiev classes. We'll look at their comparisons. Then it's the Nimitz, and then current carrier generation. What are they for? Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and thank you again for your support. Take care. Oh, and I'm going to leave you with Umbra because, let's be honest, the U class are cool, and she was very cool. She may have torpedoed an aircraft, technically, which is the best way to have done it, technically.